In this video, we'll talk about tag helpers, which are quite important for using result views. Tag helpers are like custom tags in JSP. Remember, in JSP, we use custom tags like C if, C for each, and so on. Tag helpers are similar in the sense that they are also interpreted on server and used to generate HTML. But unlike custom tags, tag helpers include both custom tags and custom attributes. For example, we've seen the partial tag in the last video to include a partial view. In this video, we'll also see custom attributes like ASP controller, ASP action, which are used for generating URLs. Tag helpers must be added to a view with the add tag helper directive before they can be used. The first parameter of the directive is the name of the tag helper class, or star for all of them, and the second parameter is the name of the assembly that contains the tag helpers. The view imports file generated by the project template already has all the ASP.NET Core built-in tag helpers, so we can use those directly in views. And speaking of built-in tag helpers, here's the documentation, and as you can see, there are quite a few of them. In this video, we'll just cover a few commonly used ones. Please take a look at the documentation when you have time to see what else is there. The most commonly used tag helpers are probably the anchor tag helpers. They are basically some custom attributes that help generating URL for anchor tags and form tags. For example, here, excuse me, by using ASP controller and ASP action, it will generate a URL like this one. So the obvious question here then is, why don't we just write this URL directly instead of using the two tag helpers, ASP controller and ASP action? Well, you can certainly do this, but the URL is a bit tricky. This URL, for example, is relative to the root of the server hosting the application, meaning that if the application is deployed at the root of the server, it will work fine. However, if the application is not deployed at root, for example, suppose we deploy our application at URL like host/myapp1, and instead of just at the root like a host. The reason for this type of deployment is that maybe you want to deploy multiple applications on the same server, so each one will have their own path. Now, if it's deployed like this, then this URL no longer works because it does not include the path for the application. Then you have to change this to something else like that. So this is why generally it's a good idea to use tag helpers and let the framework to help us figure out what's the proper URL to generate instead of hard code the URLs in the anchor or form tag directly. In addition to ASP controller and ASP action, there's another tag related to URLs, and that's the ASP route tag helper. This tag helper, as you can probably guess, is used to generate the third segment of the URL, the route parameter part. This attribute starts with ASP route and the last part is the route parameter name defined in the routing configuration. For example, in the routing configuration, the third segment of the URL is a route parameter called ID. So here, if we want to put an ID value there, we say ID after ASP route, and then we put the value in there. Now, knowing this, let's take a look at some examples. So this is a layout page, and if we run this, we can see the two links in the navigation bar, home and privacy. If we look at the code, we can see that the links are generated using the tag helpers, ASP controller, ASP action. There's another one called ASP area. Basically, if ASP.NET Core application is very complex, we can group related controllers and views together to form a so-called area. Consequently, instead of a 3-segment URL, we'll have a 4-segment URL with the first segment indicating the area. Area is not usually needed, and we won't use it in this class. Here, we can simply get rid of all these ASP area tag helpers, and it won't affect anything. So this still works exactly the same. And now let's add some links to the employee operations we have developed. Remember, in previous examples, we have developed the employee listing page showing all the employees. We implemented employee details page showing the details of the employee, and we also implemented adding an employee. So right now there's no links, and we have to manually enter the URL, which is not very convenient. So let's add some links. And for the employee functions, let's put it in the navigation bar. It's going to be handled by employees controller and the index method. So, it should be called employees, and we can click on it, and it shows here. Now, let's say if we click on the name of an employee, we'll see the employee detail page. So that means we come here, and this is the name part. Let's add a link here. So instead of using href, we'll use the ASP controller and ASP action. The action will be called details, and here we'll need the third tag helper ASP route ID, and the ID will be the employees, employees ID, something like that. And let's put employee name in here. Okay, and if we refresh, we'll see this, and this gives us the employee details page. I think this is from the example showing request parameters, I think. Let's get rid of this. Okay, and then we'll add a link to the add employee page, which should be, let's say, somewhere here. Viewback name. What's viewback name? John. Okay, let's get rid of that too. And so here we'll add a link, and this one will say controller employees, and the action ASP action is add and add. So this one will be a link, and okay, and even better, we can make that link looks like a button because we're using Bootstrap, and the Bootstrap is cool. So class button, and we'll use a primary button. Okay, so now it looks kind of nice. Okay, moving on. Okay, so another tag helper we see in the layout page is this one. So here it's called ASP Append version. So this one is quite useful for link tags, script tag, and image tags. The idea is that you may have a style sheet or a JavaScript file or an image that may change when you release a new version of your application. After you deploy a new version of your application on the server, all the files on the server will be up to date, but some client browsers may still have the old files in their cache. So how can we tell the browsers that this image or this style sheet has been changed? If we use this ASP Append version tag helper, the framework will automatically generate a new random string to attach to the URL. This way, the browser will look at this URL, notice that this part is different from the previous one, and it will know to reload this file instead of using the one in the cache. This is also known as cache busting, and with this tag helper, it's very easy to do. So quite useful for static assets that may change in different revisions or versions. And besides the anchor tag helpers, the second most important tag helper is this one, ASP4. It's used for binding form fields to model properties. The best way to understand this is to see this in an example. So let's say we want to implement the operation to edit the employee. We'll first do it without tag helper. So right now we already have the add employee operation, and if we look at the database, this is my database, tables, employees. Okay, so right now I have 6 employees from John to Sue. And let's say we want to edit an employee, maybe edit. Yeah, let's say we want to edit an employee. And we'll start by editing the employee's name and date hired. So let's do the controller part first. Now, edit is similar to add. So we can make a copy of this and change this to edit. And again, the get request will be used to display the form, and post request will be used to process the form. Now, unlike add, which will just display an empty form, edit form should already be pre-filled with the current employee's information. That, of course, requires us to get the current employee. So this edit will, of course, need an employee ID, and then we will pass the employee as a model object to the view. And when the post request comes back, it will come back with an ID plus an employee binding model, if you remember. And we'll call that one update. And we'll get we'll load the employee from the database. Excuse me. And then we'll copy over whatever in this object into the employee object. Let's say we copy over name. And let's say we'll copy over date hired as well. And then we'll save. I think we need to add another method in our service implementation. So we need to do a DB save changes. So let's add another one here, just called save changes. And here we'll implement it as save changes, and it's simply DB save changes. And for the mock implementation, save changes doesn't do anything, so it's just an empty method. Okay, so here we update the employee object, and then we simply say save changes, and that should do it. And afterward, we redirect to index. So yeah, so far so good. You may be wondering, why do we need to copy over fields instead of just save this directly? Generally speaking, it's a bad idea. Oh, missed parentheses. Generally speaking, it's a bad idea to save something provided by the user directly to your database, because a user may try to mess you up, hacking you, changing fields that they are not supposed to change, and so on. So instead of save this object directly to the database, it's much better that you pick only the fields that the user can edit and put those into the object, and you can perform some additional checking or validation or security check in this step. So here I just simply copy over two fields, basically saying that no, you are not allowed to change ID, you are not allowed to change supervisor, only these two fields. Okay, so the controller will be something like this, and the view will also be similar. So I'm going to copy over the add view and change it to edit. And so this view will guess a model, and it's going to be an employee. And so we will pre-fill the form, and that means we put in a couple of value attributes here. This one will be the employee name, and this one will be the employee's date hired. And we'll change this to save. Okay, so let's see what it looks like. Notice that right now we are not using the tech helper at all. So let's say we want to, oh, we need to add an edit as well. So let's add an edit link. We'll add it here. And let's copy over this one. So action will be edit. The ID will be employee ID, and this one will be called edit. So something like that. Again, we can make it look like a button. So we'll say plus B button B and primary. Okay. So if I click on this, it shows Jack here, which is good. But unfortunately, it doesn't show the date hired part. Now, notice that it says here, this field by default expects a date in the format of 2 digits for months, 2 digits for date, and the 4 digits for year. If we look at the generated HTML code, it's here. So it looks like this because our employee, because employee date hired is a date time property, so it generates a date plus a time. Now, if you remember when we talked about string formatting strings, there's something called custom format string and the standard format string and so on. So what we could try is, instead of just basically calling toString on this date hired property, we'll call a toString method with the D standard format string, meaning that it will output a short form date. And if we refresh, it still doesn't show anything. If we look at what's generated here, it only shows the date part, which is correct. But unfortunately, it shows 1 digit month, 1 digit date, so still not quite as was expected, and this is why it's not shown in this field. So despite that, if we actually change something, it should work. So if you can see here, we have Jack, and Jack is hired on July the 7th. And let's say we change this to Jake, and let's say Jake is hired on July the 4th. And if we save it, we can say that it's changed to Jake, and July 4th, if we look at the database, it's changing the database as well. So first of all, this operation is indeed working. It's not working perfectly in the sense that we are not pre-filled the edit form with the date hired, but it's just a display issue, and it functionality-wise, it actually works. Now, starting from this, let's add the tech helper. Let's add the tech helper ASP4. So with ASP4, we can see that we can write less code, but actually get more out of it. So let's say we use ASP4, then this one will be ASP4 name. meaning that this label is for the name property of the employee, and we can do the same thing here. And if we do that, we can actually get rid of most of the stuff. So here we only need to say ASP for this name property, and it has this bootstrap class, and we can get rid of the rest. And if we do this, and we can get rid of this, and get rid of all this. Okay, so the code looks much cleaner, and if we click on this again, we can see that not only the code looks cleaner, but it actually works better as both name and date hired are properly shown in this form. And that is because the ASP4 Tag helper will look at the type of the property and properly generate the type for the input tag, and as well as the value for the input tag. So if we look at here, we can see that this one is generated as a type datetime local and a bunch of other stuff, and the value will be the proper value that can be used with this input type. So this is the one advantage of using SP4. The framework will automatically look at the property types and generate proper HTML for those. And we can do even better. Notice that here it shows also the time part, and for date hard, we actually don't really need the time part. So what we can do is we can give the framework a hint. We can tell the framework that, hey, this one actually is a date type instead of just both date and time. And if we do that, notice that without changing anything in the view, the framework automatically changed this to a date field instead of a datetime field. And now we can try again. Everything still works. And actually we can change how the datetime is displayed on the listing page. So where is that field here? Let's do the toString short date thing. And okay, so now we have implemented edit operation using the Sp4 tag helper, which generates proper HTML based on property types, which is great. And not only that, notice that it automatically binds the value of the property to the field so that we don't have to do value something. Okay, and moving on. Okay, so there's yet another tag helper which is quite useful, which is called ASPItems, and this is quite useful for generating a drop-down list. And we'll use this to add supervisor to the mix. With this one, we will be able to generate a drop-down list and let the user to choose which supervisor the employee should have. So if you look at the code, you can see that this ASP items tag helper takes a collection, and this collection needs to be of select list item type. So let's quickly look at select list item and this one. So in order to generate a select list item, we can give it two values. One is the text, which is the text shown in the drop-down list, and the one is value. If you remember drop-down list in HTML, this one is the value for the option tag. So in other words, the value submitted to the server. Okay, so knowing that, let's change our code a little bit to incorporate the select tag or the drop-down list. So we'll go to the controller, and when the user tries to edit a user, not only we need to get the user, so we get the employee, we need to get all the employees in order to show the employees supervisor. So what we do is we can say view back and supervisors, and we'll get all the employees. Now this is all the employees. We, however, need the collection to be of select list item, and that's easy with link. So we'll do a select, and for each employee, we'll create a new select list item. Let's import this. And for each item, we will use the employee's name as the text and the employee's ID as the value. Okay, something like that. And then we'll say to list. Oh, so this one needs to be a string. So let's do a toString to convert integer to string. Okay, so this gives us a list of select list item, and then we will have another one, and this one will be for supervisor ID. Now notice that this one should be for supervisor ID because we are going to submit ID as the value submitted for the drop-down list, and we'll call this label supervisor, and this one will be this. Okay, so we'll have a select for this property with this collection as the possible values. Let's see what it looks like. And if I try to edit this, it shows the drop-down list here. Okay, so let's also add the Bootstrap class. Okay, looks better. Now we get a list of users as possible supervisors. Now notice that Jack is also in this list, and we don't want Jack to be his own supervisor. So what we can do is we can remove Jack from here. We can say where ID is not this ID. So this should remove Jack. Here we also need to do supervisor ID is update supervisor ID. Okay, so let's try again. Employee and edit. So notice that Jack is no longer here. So let's say Jack's supervisor is Bob, and let's also change Jack's date hired to the 4th. So it shows Bob here, it shows 4th here. If we look at the database, it shows 4th here, and the supervisor is ID is 4, which is indeed Bob. Okay, so this is how we can implement the edit employee operation. As you can see, with the help of tag helpers, it's actually pretty nice and easy. The, the edit form is pretty simple looking, and with the help of the framework, it's quite nice. So not only the form is pre-filled, but also notice that inside the drop-down list is pre-selected with the current supervisor. So um, everything looks nice with fairly simple code, thanks to the framework. Okay, all right. So that's about it for tag helpers. Here, let's have a quick word about the so-called HTML helpers. HTML helpers are a number of helper methods that can be used in reserve views to generate HTML. Most of the HTML helpers are superseded by tag helpers. For example, instead of using HTML display name 4, we now use ASP4. And instead of using HTML action link, we now use ASP controller, ASP action, and ASP route ID. Now, with that said, there are some HTML helpers that don't have equivalent tag helpers yet. So those are still useful. For example, if you want to output a string without escaping the special characters, you'll need to use the HTML raw helper method. So there are a few of those like that. If you need to do something and if there's no tag helper, chances are there's a HTML helper there. Okay, so this is the end of this video. Tech helpers are in chapter 8 of the ASP.NET Core book. Please check it out. Thanks and see you in the next video.